Hello. There's like buried in Mahabharata that has survived thousands of years, and it says something so audacious, so breathtakingly confident that it stops you cold the first time you read it. It says, "Whatever is here is found elsewhere, but whatever is not here is found nowhere." Think about that for a moment. Not as a religious doctrine, not as an ancient boast. Think about it the way you would if a wise, world weary friend looked you in the eye across a table and said, "Everything you will ever feel, every impossible choice you will ever face, every love and loss and betrayal and redemption you will ever live through, it's all already in this story." That is the Mahabharat's promise to you. And remarkably, astonishingly, after more than 2,000 years, it keeps it. This book is an invitation to read the Mahabharata not as a relic behind the glass, not as the exclusive property of scholars or priests, but as a living text, a mirror, a companion for the exact life you are living right now, with its confusion, its moral gray zones, its heartbreaks that don't resolve neatly, its questions that don't come with answers. But before we can walk into that story, we need to understand where it comes from. Not because history is a prerequisite to meaning, it is, but because knowing how the Mahabharata was born, who shaped it, how long it took, and what kind of tradition it belongs to, it'll help you hold it differently. It'll help you understand why it feels so alive, so unfinished, so disturbingly relevant to the present moment. So let's begin at the beginning, or as close to the beginning as we can get. Imagine for a moment that every significant thought a civilization ever had was written down. Every philosophical argument, every law, every prayer, every myth, every conversation between a teacher and a student sitting on the banks of a river at dawn, every genealogy, every cosmological theory, every instruction for how to live and how to die. Now imagine that this went on for roughly 3,000 years. That, very roughly, is the Hindu literary tradition. It is an ocean. And like any ocean, it is both navigable and humbling. It contains the Vedas, among the oldest religious texts humanity has ever produced, composed not by identifiable authors but received, according to tradition, as revelation. The word Shruti, which is what the Vedas belong to, literally means that which was heard. These were not written, they were known. They existed in the breath of reciters, passed mouth to ear to mouth across generations with a precision that modern scholars find almost impossible to believe. Then comes the vast body of Vedanta literature, the Brahmanas, the Aranyakas, the Upanishads, which unpack, philosophize, debate, and sometimes radically reinterpret what the Vedas contain. The Upanishads alone have generated centuries of commentary, counter commentary, and synthesis. If you have ever encountered the ideas of Brahman and Atman, the self dissolving into the universal self, the nature of consciousness, the illusion of the separate ego, you have touched Vedantic thought. Much of what the modern world calls Eastern philosophy flows from here. Beyond Vedanta, there are the Vedangas, six disciplines attached to the Vedas like branches from a trunk, covering phonetics, meter, grammar, etymology, astronomy, and ritual. There are the Smritis, text of remembered teaching, carrying legal and ethical codes. There are the Puranas, 18 major ones and many minor ones, which are encyclopedias of cosmology, mythology, history, and genealogy. One of the minor Puranas, the Bhavishya Puran, is so recent in parts that it mentions Queen Victoria. This is not an embarrassment, but a feature. The tradition was never static. It breathed and grew and adopted, absorbing what it encountered. It is an enormous, plural, sometimes contradictory, always alive tradition. And somewhere within it, not quite belonging to one category, defying easy classification, sits the Itihas, the two great epics, the Ramayana and the Mahabharata. The word we translate into English as history is itihas, and that translation, while convenient, loses something essential. Iti means does, ha is an emphatic particle, meaning indeed or certainly. Asa comes from the verb to be in the past tense. Taken together, itihas means thus indeed it was. Or more fully, this is indeed what happened. This is not myth. This is not metaphor. This is not allegory invented to teach a lesson, even when it contains lessons. According to the tradition itself, itihas is a fact. It is a chronicle. It is the record of events that actually occurred in the world. Now, you may immediately raise an eyebrow at this. You are living in an age of evidence based reasoning, of peer review, of archaeological verification. You know that texts are shaped by their authors, their context, their agendas. You are right to hold that awareness. We will not ask you to set this aside. But here is what we will ask: do not let that awareness become a barrier. Because whether or not every event in the Mahabharata occurred exactly as described, the text is true in the deepest sense. Not empirically verifiable in every detail, but true to the nature and true to the texture of human experience. True to how people actually behave under pressure. True to how power corrupts, how love complicates, how grief breaks people often. True in the way that great literature is always true, not by reporting facts, but by illuminating what it means to be alive. The tradition calls its history because it insists these things happen. We can hold that lightly, with respect, without needing to resolve the question scientifically. What matters is what the story does to us when we encounter it. So, Itihas consists of two texts, the Ramayana and the Mahabharata. They are siblings, but very different ones. The Ramayana is the older, smaller, more polished of the two. It was composed by Valmiki, who is celebrated as the Adikavi, the first poet. The word kavi is usually translated as poet, but its primary meaning is one who is wise. A poet, in the ancient understanding, was not simply someone who could arrange words beautifully. A poet was someone who could see clearly, who had the clarity of vision to perceive truth and the craft to transmit it. Valmiki was such a person. The Ramayana, even in its original Sanskrit, has a quality of luminosity. Its narrative is structured, its moral landscape is relatively clear. Ram is virtuous, Ravan is the antagonist, Sita is the devoted. Hanuman is loyal. These are not simple characters, not quite, but the architecture of the story has a certain cleanliness to it. Good and evil are identified. The path, however painful, is discernible. Then there is the Mahabharata, and everything changes. The Mahabharata is larger, older in its roots, later in its final form, and almost entirely without the Ramayan's clarity. It is a text that seems to have been written by life itself, by all the accumulated wisdom and confusion and moral entanglement of a civilization grappling with impossible questions. It is not clean, it is not simple, and it is not finished. Even now, after centuries of commentary, it is not finished. It is also, for these very reasons, the more honest of the two. and the more necessary. The Mahabharata was composed, or rather began, with a man known as Vedavyasa, or more formally, Krishna Dvaipayana Vedavyasa. Let's unpack that name because it tells you a great deal. Veda, you already know, the ancient text of revelation. Vyasa means one who classified, organized, arranged. So Veda Vyasa is a title, not a birth name. It means the one who arranged the Vedas. According to tradition, this is a recurring task. Once in a great while, as civilization shifts and human understanding evolves, the Vedas need to be reorganized and represented. Each person who performs this task receives the title of Vedavyasa. By the time of our story, there had already been 27 such Vyasas, or Vyasa was the 28th. His birth name was Krishna Dvaipayana. Dvaipayana because he was born on an island, Dvipa. Krishna because he was dark complexioned. Krishna meaning dark or black was a common name in ancient India. It was not exclusive to the divine incarnation of Vishnu, though the resonance between the two Krishnas in the Mahabharata story is deeply intentional. Krishna Dvaipayana Vedavyasa was not simply the author of the Mahabharata in the way we think of authorship today. He was a participant in the story he told. He was, in fact, the biological grandfather of the very protagonist whose conflict forms the epic's core. Born on the sage Parashara and a woman named Satyavati, he fathered sons on the wives of his half brother Vichitravirya. After that, king died without heirs, and those sons became Dhritarashtra and Pandu, fathers respectively of the Kauravas and the Pandavas. Think about that. The author of the story is also its grandfather. He shaped the events and then narrated them. He is inside and outside the text simultaneously. It is one of the most remarkable authorial positions in all of world literature, and it prefigures the questions about perspective and bias and inherited trauma that the entire epic will keep returning to. The Mahabharata did not arrive in the world the way a modern book does, fully formed, printed, bound, and distributed. It arrived the way all ancient knowledge arrived, through the human voice. The, these were oral traditions. There was no question of writing things down in the early years. Text existed in memory, in recitation, in the relationship between teacher and student, narrator and listener. The Smriti tradition, the tradition of remembered teaching, was not a lesser form of knowledge preservation. It was a sophisticated, carefully cultivated art. Reciters trained for years to carry text in their bodies, in their breath, in the precise pitch and rhythm of the delivery. Vedavyasa composed the Mahabharata and taught it to his disciple Vaishampayana. That was the first transmission. And the story of how it entered public circulation is itself a story within the story. Parikshit, the grandson of Arjuna and the heir who inherited the throne of Hastinapur after the Kurukshetra war, was killed by a serpent. His son, Janamejaya, enraged and grief stricken, organized a massive snake sacrifice, a ritual designed to destroy all serpents in retribution. With the great sages of the age assembled for the ceremony, Vaishampayana was present. The assembled sages wanted to hear the great story that Vedavyasa had composed. Janamejaya was also there, also wanted to understand why his father had been killed. And so, in that charged atmosphere of grief and power and ritual, Vaishampayana recited the Mahabharata for the first time to a public audience. But there is yet another circle. Much later, at a great sacrifice in Naimisharanya, a gathering of sages asked a man named Lumarshana and Ugrashava to use his proper name to repeat what he had heard at Janamajaya's snake sacrifice. Lumarshana was a Suta, a charioteer bard, one of the professional raconteurs of ancient India. His name means one whose tales make the body hair stand on end. Loma meaning body hair, Harshana meaning that which causes to stand. He is also sometimes called Souti, referring to his parentage. So the Mahabharata, as we encounter it, is a story told within a story. Numarshana narrates what Vaishampayana narrated, what Vedavyasa composed. Voices nested within voices, each adding a layer of distance and intimacy simultaneously. This is not an accident of oral culture. It is a deliberate structural choice that signals something important. There is no single unmeditated power, unmediated perspective in this epic. Every telling is filtered through a teller. Every version of events is someone's version. And the truth, if it exists, lives somewhere in the resonance between them. He, Here is something that may surprise you. There is not one Mahabharata, there are three. Or rather, the text we have today is the third and largest of three distinct versions, each building on the one before. The original one was called Jaya, meaning victory. It contained approximately 8,800 verses and told the core story of the war and its consequences. It was a relatively contained, focused narrative. This was expanded into a version called Bharat, which grew to 24,000 verses. New storylines were added, genealogies elaborated, philosophical passages deepened. Finally, the Mahabharata, the great Bharat, emerged at around 90,000 to 100,000 verses. If you include the Harivamsha, the appendix that serves as an epilogue, the total comes to approximately 90,000 verses. In Sanskrit, each verse is typically a couplet of two lines. If you translate that into English words, you are looking at roughly 2 million words. The Mahabharata is nearly four times the length of Ramayana and longer than any other epic anywhere in the world. The ancient text itself tells us that Vedavyasa composed this in 3 years. Even if that refers only to the first version, the Jaya, it is a breathtaking act of intellectual and creative energy. And in addition to the Mahabharata, Vedvyas composed the 18 major Puranas, another 400,000 verses. One person or one title passed across many lifetimes. Either way, an extraordinary legacy. Here's, here's where we need to be honest with, and where the story of the Mahabharata comes, if anything, more interesting rather than less. The Mahabharata was not composed by a single author at a single moment in time. It grew over centuries, probably between 800 BCE and 400 CE, a span of more than 1,000 years. Different voices added to the text. Some added episodes and subplots. Some added philosophical discourses. Some added genealogies and cosmological theories. Some were responding to political realities of their own time. Some were deepening the spiritual teachings of an earlier generation. Some may have been revising what they felt was an incomplete or even incorrect version of events. Statistical analysis has been applied to the text to try to identify the number of distinct authors. Scholars may have spent entire careers on the question of which sections are original and which are interpolations, later editions that were folded into the body of the text. The Bhagavad Gita itself, that famous philosophical dialogue at the heart of the Mahabharata, is believed by many scholars to have been a separate text that was later integrated into the epic. None of this diminishes the Mahabharata. In fact, it makes it richer. The text is not the product of a single consciousness, but of an entire civilization wrestling with itself over more than a millennium. Its contradictions are not editorial failures, they are the traces of real debates, real disagreements, real revisions in how people understood dharma, duty, power, and the divine. You will encounter these contradictions as you read. There are places where the text seems to say something and then quietly says the opposite. There are characters who are condemned in one passage and celebrated in another. There are theological positions that appear to conflict. Do not try to resolve all of them into a single coherent doctrine. The Mahabharata resists that kind of taming. Sit with the contradictions. They are the point. To understand the Mahabharata's cast of characters, you need to know something about the genealogical tree they all grow from. This is not dry history, it is essential context, and some of it is genuinely fascinating. Hindu tradition speaks of two great dynasties, the Surya Vamsha, the Solar dynasty, and the Chandra Vamsha, the Lunar dynasty. The Ramayana is the story of the Solar dynasty. Rama is a prince of the sun descendant line of Ayodhya. The Mahabharata is the story of the Lunar dynasty. The Lunar dynasty begins, appropriately enough, with Soma, the moon. It passes through a chain of kings and sages that include Pururava, who loved the celestial nymph Urvashi in one of the great tragic love stories of Sanskrit literature, and his descendants, Nahusha and Yayati. Yayati is one of those figures who appears briefly in the genealogy, but whose story opens up into something deeper. He was a king who grew old before he was ready to let go of the pleasures of youth. He asked his sons to loan him their youth, to let him inhabit their young bodies while they took on his old age temporarily. All but one refused. Those who refused were cursed never to be kings. And the Yadavs, the clan, the clan to which Krishna would eventually belong, descended from Yadu, carry this curse. The one son who agreed was Puru, and the Lunar dynasty continued through him. Follow the line through Puru's descendants, and you reach Dushanta, whose romance with the forest girl Shakuntala was immortalized by the great playwright Kalidas. Their son was Bharat, a name that persists to this day in the word Bharatvarsh, one of the Sanskrit names for India. Bharat's grandson was Kuru, who gives his name to the Kuru dynasty and to Kurukshetra, the field of battle. Kuru's descendant was Shantanu, a king of Hastinapur, and here the story begins to accelerate towards the events of the epic. Shantanu fathered a son by the river goddess Ganga, and that son was Bhishma, one of the greatest and most tragic figures in the entire Mahabharata. Later, Shantanu fell in love with a woman named Satyavati. Satyavati had already had a son by the sage Parashara. Krishna Vaipayana or Vedavyasa, the author of the story. With Shantanu, she had two more sons, Chitrangada and Vichitravirya. Vichitravirya died young and childless. In the custom of the age, Vedavyasa, Satyavati's son from before her marriage, fathered children on Vichitravirya's widows. Those sons were Dhritarashtra, born blind, and Pandu. Pandu's sons are the Pandavas. Dhritarashtra's sons are the Kauravas, as the Sanskrit more precisely renders. And here is something worth pausing on. The word Kaurava applies to both groups equally. Both the Pandavas and Dhritarashtra's sons descended from Kuru. Both are Kauravas. When we call Duryodhan and his brothers the Kauravas and the Pandavas opponents, we are using the name in a limited colloquial sense that the text itself sometimes complicates. They are all of the same blood. They are all members of the same family. The Mahabharata is, among other things, a civil war. And like all civil wars, it is the most painful kind. By now, you may have noticed something. This is not a story about good people and bad people. It is not a story where the heroes are purely heroic and the villains are purely villainous. We tend to receive the Mahabharata through abridged versions, shorter retellings, comic books, television serials, children's adaptations, and these versions, out of necessity, simplify. The Pandavas became the heroes, the Kauravas become the villains. Krishna is always wise and always right. Duryodhan is always envious and always wrong. Good triumphs the end. The unabridged Mahabharata is a different beast entirely. Duryodhan, often called Suyodhan, meaning good warrior, by those who admire him, is not simply a villain. He's a man of genuine courage and loyalty, capable of deep friendship, betrayed by his own worst impulses, but not reducible to them. The text itself, in multiple places, takes what can only be called a pro Kaurava position. There are passages that question Krishna's choices. There are episodes that make the Pandavas look less than noble. History, as someone wise once observed, is written between the victors. But the Mahabharata, unusually and remarkably, also contains the voices that lost. This is what makes it so honest, so difficult, so necessary. You are living in a world that is, in many ways, a morally complicated as anything the Mahabharata describes. You are surrounded by information at yet uncertain about truth. You are asked to make choices whose consequences you cannot fully predict. You have family members who hold views that feel uh, irreconcilable with your own. You have watched institutions fail people who trusted them. You have experienced or witnessed the specific pain of trying to do the right thing and finding that there is no consensus on what the right thing is. The Mahabharata was written for precisely this kind of world. Not because it gives answers, it doesn't, not really. The Bhagavad Gita offers a framework, not a formula. The great figures of the epic, Bhishma, Karna, Drona, Draupadi, and Yudhishthir, each embody different ways of responding to impossible situations, and none of them emerge entirely unscathed, none entirely vindicated. But the Mahabharata insists that these questions are worth asking, that the act of asking them, of sitting with the discomfort of not knowing, of refusing to flatten moral complexity into easy slogans, this itself is a form of wisdom. And that is what this book is about. So, in the chapters that follow, we are going to walk through the Mahabharata together, not as a recitation of the plot, but as a sustained meditation on what this story says about human nature. We will meet Bhishma, the man who gave up everything for his father's happiness and spent the rest of his life paying for that sacrifice. We will spend time with Karna, perhaps the most heartbreaking figure in any literature anywhere. A man of extraordinary gifts who was denied dignity by the accident of his birth. We will sit with Draupadi in her fury and her grief, and we will ask the questions she demanded be asked. We will follow Yudhishthir as he discovers that righteousness pursued without wisdom can become its own kind of violence. And we will grapple with Krishna, the most enigmatic, most unsettling, most magnificent figure in the story, and ask with honest curiosity whether he was always right. We will let the Mahabharata be exactly what it is: vast, contradictory, alive with human emotion, and stubbornly, magnificently unresolved. And in doing so, we will find if the text promise holds that whatever you are carrying right now, whatever impossible choice you're facing, whatever grief or love or confusion is living inside you, there is someone in this story who has already walked that road. You are not alone in your Kurukshetra. No one ever is. Chapter 1, Anukramanika Parva. Before any great story begins, there is a moment of gap, a breath before the first word, a pause in which the storyteller looks at the audience and the audience looks back, and something unspoken passes between them. This matters. Pay attention. What comes next will ask something of you. The Mahabharata opens with exactly such a moment. The first section of the epic is called the Anukramanika Parva. The word Anukramanika means index or table of contents or summary in sequence. And on the surface, this is what this Parva appears to be: a brief introductory section that sets up the background for the recital, outlines the main events of the story, and offers some context before the real narrative begins. But spend a little time with it, and you will discover that it is far more than a table of contents. It is an overture. It is the kind of opening movement that composers put before an opera, where all the major themes are introduced in compressed, concentrated form, so that when you hear them again later, fully developed, something in you already recognizes them. The Anukramanika Parva introduces the Mahabharata's deepest themes: the nature of time, the weight of grief, the relationship between fate and choice, and the question of what it actually means to listen to a story. It does all of this in 210 shlokas and one chapter. It was almost certainly composed later than the core text, added as a frame and an orientation. But do not let that diminish it. The people who added it knew what they were doing. Let's walk through it together. The Mahabharata begins not with a king or a warrior or a divine being. It begins with a gathering of sages in a forest. This is Naimisharanya, a sacred grove that ancient tradition identifies with a region near present day Sitapur in Uttar Pradesh. The word Aranya means forest. Naimisha refers to the moment of a twinkling or a fleeting instant. There is a tradition that says this place was chosen because the wheel of the god Brahma's weapon, the Nimisha disc, fell to earth here, its rotation stopping exactly at this spot, where the divine wheel stopped spinning, a place of stillness was born. The sages gathered here are in the middle of a 12-year sacrifice organized by a man named Shaunaka, who is described as the Kulapati. The word Kulapati means the head of a lineage or institution, and more specifically, someone who feeds and teaches 10,000 students. This is not a small gathering of scholars in a quiet room. This is a community of learning and practice, sustaining itself through ritual and inquiry, committed to the long work of understanding. Into this gathering walks Ugrashava, the son of Lumaharshana. He is a Suta, and this word requires a moment of attention because it carries more meaning than it first appears to be. In the ancient social structure, a Suta was the son of a Kshatriya father and a Brahman mother. By profession, Sutas were charioteers, but they were also bards and raconteurs, the keepers and transmitters of stories. They rode beside kings in the heat of battle and remembered everything. They carried history in their bodies the way warriors carried weapons. Ugrashava is also known as Souti, referring to his birth, and as Lomaharshana, because the stories he told made the body hair stand on end in wonder. He has just come from Janamejaya's great snake sacrifice, where he heard Vaishampayana recite the Mahabharata for the first time to a public audience. He has wandered since then through many places of pilgrimage, and now he has arrived at Naimisharanya, bowing in humility before the assembled sages. The sages naturally want to hear whatever he has brought with him. This scene is worth sitting for a moment before we move on, because it tells you something important about the Mahabharata beliefs knowledge is for and how it travels. Knowledge in this tradition does not live in books, it lives in people. It lives in the relationship between the one who knows and the one who wants to know. The sages at Naimisharanya are already deep in their own practice, their own learning, their own years of sustained inquiry. They are not passive consumers, they are active recipients whose own preparation makes them capable of receiving what Suti carries. And Suti is not simply a messenger, he is a transformer. The story he tells has passed through multiple filters. For Vedavyasa, who composed it, to Vaishampayana, who received it, to Suti, who, who heard it at Janamejaya's sacrifice, to the sages who will hear it now. Each transmission adds something. Each listener shapes what comes next. This is how wisdom moves, not by download, but by conversation. Not by one voice broadcasting into silence, but by voices in dialogue across generations. Before Suti says anything else, before a single detail of the story is shared, the text offers an invocation. Jaya must be recited after having bowed in obeisance before Narayana and also Nara, the supreme human being, and also the goddess Saraswati. Three names, three invocations. Let's unpack each one because this is not decoration. This is a deliberate statement of what the story is about and what it will require of you. Narayana is one of the primary names of Vishnu, the preserver of the universe in the Hindu trinity. The name itself has roots in Nara, water or humanity, and Ayana, path or a board, the one who moves upon the waters, or the one who is the dwelling place of all beings. In the Mahabharata, Narayana is identified with Krishna, the divine figure at the center of the epic's most famous episode, the Bhagavad Gita. By beginning with Narayana, the invocation announces this is not just a human story, the divine is present here. Nara means human being, and specifically in the tradition, Nara refers to the sage who is paired with Narayana as an eternal companion. In the epic, Nara comes to be identified with Arjuna, the great warrior who repeats the teaching of the Bhagavad Gita. Nara and Narayana are, in a sense, the human and the divine in relationship, inseparable, each needing the other. By invoking both together, the text says this story is about what happens when divinity meets humanity, when the cosmic meets the personal, when the eternal wisdom of the universe presses up against the finite confusion of a single human life. Saraswati is the goddess of knowledge, learning, wisdom, speech, and the arts. She holds a veena and a book, and she sits on a lotus. She is invoked here not merely as a ritual gesture, but as a genuine acknowledgement. To tell a story this large, to carry its meaning faithfully across time and through many tellings, requires something more than skill. It requires grace. It requires the gift of the right words arriving at the right moment to illuminate what might otherwise remain in darkness. So, before we hear a single event of the Mahabharata, we are told this story lives at the intersection of the divine and the human, and it requires wisdom to receive it well. This is not a bad way to approach any important story. One of the most striking moments in the Anukramanika Parva is a pair of metaphors that appear almost as asides, tucked into the broader summary of events, but unforgettable once you encounter them. The Mahabharat's conflict, at its most basic, is between two sets of cousins, the Pandavas, son of Pandu, and the Kauravas, son of Dhritarashtra. Most of us know the outline. The Pandavas are the protagonist, the Kauravas are their antagonist, and the entire epic builds toward their catastrophic clash at Kurukshetra. But the text does not describe this conflict in those terms. It does not call one side good and one side evil. Instead, it offers two images. The first, Duryodhan is a great tree created out of passion. Karna is its trunk. Shakuni is its branches. Dushasan is the plentiful fruit and flowers. And the mindless Dhritarashtra is its root. The second, Yudhishthir, is a great tree created out of righteousness. Arjun is its trunk. Bhim is its branches. The two sons of Madri are its plentiful fruit and flowers. And Krishna, Brahma, and the Brahmanas are its root. Read those images carefully. The structure is identical: a tree with a root, a trunk, branches, and fruit. The Mahabharata is telling you that both sides have the same basic form. Both are trees, both are systems of relationship, loyalty, and mutual sustenance. Both grow from something, reach towards something, and produce something. The difference is not in their structure. The difference is in what they are rooted in. Duryodhana's tree grows from Dhritarashtra's blindness, literal and metaphorical. The blind father who could not see his sons clearly, who indulged them because he could not bear to deny them anything, who let love curdle into permissiveness and permissiveness curdle into catastrophe. This tree is rooted in passion, in the untamed force of desire, ego, and attachment. Its fruit is Dushasan's cruelty. Its branches are Shakuni's cunning. Its trunk is Karna's pride mixed with genuine greatness. And the whole structure is, despite its apparent magnificence, built on a foundation that cannot hold. Yudhishthir's tree is rooted in something different. It is rooted in dharma, in righteousness, in Krishna, and the sacred traditions of knowledge. Its trunk is Arjuna, the warrior who asks the deepest questions. Its branches are Bhim, the force of righteous anger. Its fruit are the two sons of Madri, Nakul and Sahdev, who bring grace and wisdom to the periphery of the story. Notice that this is not a simple contrast between good people and bad people. Karna is the trunk of Duryodhan's tree, and Karna is arguably the most sympathetic figure in the entire epic. He is gifted, loyal, generous, and profoundly wronged by the world's cruelty to him. His presence as the trunk of the wrong tree does not make him villainous, it makes the situation tragic. The Mahabharata is saying it is not enough to have virtuous individuals. What matters is what those individuals are rooted in, what sustains them, what they draw their nourishment from. A person of genuine gifts, like Karna, can be part of a structure that leads to destruction if the root of that structure is deceased. And a person of genuine flaws, like Yudhishthir, with his addiction to gambling and his sometimes paralyzing adherence to rules, can be part of a structure that leads to righteousness if the root of that structure is sound. The question the Mahabharata asks us from its very chapter is not, are you a good person? The question is, what are you rooted in? The Anukramanika Parva does something audacious. It summarizes the entire Mahabharata twice, once in a brief narrative overview, and once through the voice of Dhritarashtra himself in a long, devastating sequence of regrets. Dhritarashtra, the blind king, father of Duryodhan, speaks to his charioteer and advisor Sanjay after the war has ended and everything has been lost. And what he says is, in its repetitive, relentless way, one of the most remarkable expressions of hindsight in all of world literature. He does not say, I should have done this differently. He does not analyze or argue or make excuses. He simply says over and over again in an accumulating drumbeat of sorrow, Oh Sanjay, I had no hope of victory when I heard. Then he describes a moment, an event, a turning point, something he heard about from a distance that he knew in that moment signaled the direction of fate. Then he says it again and again, over 50 times. I had no hope of victory when I heard that Draupadi, with protectors, but as if no protectors existed, was dragged to court at the time of her period with a single garment on and with tears in her throat. I had no hope of victory when I heard that Arjun, overcome by lassitude, had sunk down on his chariot, and Krishna had shown him all the worlds within his own body. I had no hope of victory when I heard that Bhishma, the great destroyer of enemies, was killing tens of thousands of charioteers every day, but had not killed a single warrior of note. The repetition is intentional. It is not a rhetorical failure, it is a rhetorical achievement. Each repetition accumulates weight. The way grief accumulates weight, the way the recognition of irreversible mistakes accumulates weight. Dhritarashtra is not describing a single bad decision. He is tracing the entire arc of a catastrophe that had been inevitable from many, many moments before the final battle. He's saying, I knew at each of these moments, I knew, and I did nothing. This is one of the most psychologically honest portraits of complicity in any literature anywhere. Dhritarashtra was not an evil man. He was a blind man in more ways than one. He loved his sons with a love that was real and deep, and that love made him unable to act when action was required. He let things slide again and again because intervening would have meant confronting his sons, and he could not bear to do that. And so each moment passed, each warning went unheeded, each injustice was allowed to stand, and the catastrophe that had been avoidable at 100 different points became, in the end, unavoidable. We do not need to be kings of ancient India to recognize this pattern. Think about the relationships, institutions, or situations in your own life where you knew something was going wrong and said nothing, where you saw the early signs of a problem and looked away, where your love for someone or your fear of conflict or your hope that things would sort themselves out meant that you kept quiet at a moment when speaking up might have changed everything. Dhritarashtra's lament is not ancient story. It is a mirror. After Dhritarashtra finishes his long catalogue of regrets, he says something that perhaps surprises you. I wish to give up my life immediately. This is not a metaphor. He's saying he wants to die. He has lost everything: his sons, his kingdom, his hopes, the world as he knew it. What is the point of continuing? And Sanjay, the charioteer, the man who was given divine sight by Vedavyas so that he could observe the Kurukshetra war from a distance and report it to Dhritarashtra, answers him. Sanjay's answer is not a pep talk. He does not say things will get better. He does not offer false consolation. Instead, he names the great kings of history one after another, rulers of enormous power and virtue and accomplishment, and reminds Dhritarashtra they too died. They too lost everything in the end. This is not an exception, this is the rule. And then he says something that cuts to the philosophical heart of the entire Mahabharata. He says, time brings existence and non existence, pleasure and pain. Time creates all elements and time destroys all beings. Time burns all subjects, and it is time that extinguishes the fire. Time alone is awake when everything is asleep. Time cannot be conquered. Time walks in all elements, pervasive and impartial. Knowing that everything past, present, and future is created by time, it is not appropriate that you should be consumed by grief. Let's sit with this. The Sanskrit word for time here is kar, and kar is not simply clock time, the ticking of seconds and the turning of years. Kar is the great force that underlies all. It is the power that transforms the seed into the tree, the child into the elder, the empire into ruins. It is what the physicists might call entropy if entropy were divine, the relentless movement of all things toward change, dissolution, and renewal. And Sanjay is saying, Karl is not your enemy. It is not punishing you. It is not singling you out. It is simply doing what it always does, what it has always done, and what it will always do. The greatest kings who ever lived were carried along by car and set down again in death. Your sons were carried along by car. The Pandavas, who have won this war, will also be carried along by car. Nothing is exempt. This could sound like cold comfort. It could sound like a philosophy of resignation. Nothing matters, so why try? But this is a misreading. Sanjay is not arguing for passivity, he's arguing for perspective. Grief is appropriate. Grief is human and real and necessary, but being consumed by grief, being so overwhelmed by loss that you lose your capacity to see clearly and act rightly, that is the danger. Sanjay is giving Dhritarashtra the one tool that might allow him to continue living with some dignity, the understanding that his loss, however real and devastating, is part of a pattern larger than himself. That he's not uniquely cursed, that time, which has taken everything from him, takes everything from everyone and has been doing so since before memory. This is not therapy in the modern sense, but it is not far from what modern psychology calls perspective taking, the capacity to locate your own suffering with a larger context without diminishing it, which reduces the feeling of being singled out by fate and opens up the possibility of resilience. The Mahabharata begins, in other words, with a lesson in how to survive grief, not by avoiding it, not by pretending it does not exist, but by understanding it as a part of something larger than yourself. The Anukramanika Parva closes with a passage that is part proclamation and part invitation. The ancient tradition, as the text records it, describes a moment when the gods and sages gathered and placed the four Vedas on one side of a scale and the Mahabharata on the other. The Mahabharata was heavier in substance and content. It outweighed the four Vedas combined, and because of this, it came to be known as the Mahabharata, the Great Bharata. This is a bold claim. The Vedas are the foundational text of Hindu revelation, the most sacred corpus in the tradition. To say that the Mahabharata outweighs them is not to disrespect the Vedas. It is to say something specific about the Mahabharata's relationship to human experience. The Vedas, in their original form, are text of revelation. They are truth given directly without the mediation of human story or human struggle. They are pure knowledge, but pure knowledge, however sacred, requires human beings to carry it into the world. And human beings are messy, contradictory, fallible, passionate, and endlessly complex. The Mahabharata is the place where that pure knowledge meets that messy humanity. It is the crucible. The text says something else that bears attention. The Vedas should be supported with Itihas and the Puranas, but the Vedas are afraid of those with little learning, lest that knowledge be hurt. This is a remarkable image. The Vedas afraid, sacred knowledge vulnerable. The idea is that knowledge in the wrong hands or received without sufficient preparation can be misused, misunderstood, twisted to serve ends that betray its original purpose. Anyone who has watched ideology be weaponized or wisdom be reduced to slogan knows exactly what this fear refers to. But the Mahabharata is different. The passage argues because it is protected by its very complexity, you cannot extract a simple, dangerous slogan from the Mahabharata. Every time you try to reduce it to a single message, a counterexample rises up to complicate it. Its nuance is its armor. And then this. Without a doubt, the sin of killing an embryo is also destroyed. This is the tradition's way of saying that engaging sincerely with the text, opening yourself to its questions and its demands, is a form of purification, not magic, not superstition, but the genuine transformation that happens when you encounter a story large enough to hold your whole life. Before any of the battles begin, before Bhishma makes his oath, or Karna is born, or Draupadi is wed, before Arjun sits in his chariot and asks his great question, before any of it, the Mahabharata pauses and tells you something about how to read what follows. It tells you about the nature of time, that everything passes. Grief is real and yet need not consume you. That the great ones who came before you also fell, and that this is not tragedy but reality. It tells you about the nature of stories, that they travel through people, that each telling adds something, that the story you receive is shaped by everyone who carried it before you reached it. It gives you the image of two trees and asks you, what are you rooted in? What nourishes the structure of your life? Not are you good or bad, but what holds you up? It gives you Dhritarashtra's lament and asks you, where in your own life have you known something was wrong and said nothing? Where has your love made you complicit? Where have you been watching these signs accumulate and hoping they would amount to nothing? And it invokes wisdom, the divine and the sacred, as genuine, necessary companions for the journey ahead, not as a decoration, not as a religion in the superficial sense, but as acknowledgement that some journeys require more than personal effort. Some questions are larger than individual intelligence. Some situations call for grace. This is the overture. This is the gathering breath before the first word. of the story. The Anukramanika Parva also contains something worth knowing for purely practical reasons as you make your way through this book. The Mahabharat's major sections are called Parvas, and the 100 Parva classification, which scholars believe to be older, is embedded within the better known 18 Parva classification. The 100 Parva structure is like a detailed map. It names individual episodes, events, and turning points with great specificity. The 18 Parva structure is like a large scale overview. It groups those episodes into broader movements. As we walk through the Mahabharata together in the chapters ahead, we will move through both structures using whichever lens brings the material most clearly into focus. Sometimes we will zoom in to a single scene or conversation and stay there for a while because some moments deserve that kind of attention. Sometimes we will zoom out and look at the shape of an entire arc, how a character's life moves from beginning to end, what it adds up to, what it means. The goal throughout is not comprehensiveness. The Mahabharata is 2 million words. This book is not. The goal is resonance. The goal is to find the places where the ancient text and the present moment touched each other, where something in the story illuminates something in your experience, and something in your experience illuminates something in the story. That exchange, the mutual illumination, is what reading the Mahabharata is for. The sages at Naimisharanya understood this. They were already deep in their own practice when Souti arrived. They could have turned him away. They had their own work to do. Instead, they made room for him, welcomed him, and asked him to speak. That is the right posture for what comes next. Make room. Ask the story to speak.